For 3 years, the German Wehrmacht had mastered the art of survival. They knew the mathematics of artillery by heart. If a shell was screaming toward you, you dove into a foxhole, pressed your face into the mud, and waited for the impact. As long as you were below ground level, the shrapnel would fly over your head. The earth was your shield. The trench was your sanctuary. But on the morning of December 16, 1944, in the frozen shadows of the Ardennes forest, those rules of survival were permanently deleted. German veterans, men who had walked through the fire of Stalingrad and Kursk, looked up in horror as American shells began to do the impossible. They didn't hit the ground. They didn't crater the soil. Instead, they burst with a blinding flash 30 feet above the treetops, turning the air itself into a meat grinder. Foxholes weren't shields anymore. They were open-topped coffins. This is the story of the proximity fuse, the $1 billion secret that was banned from the battlefield for years, because the Americans were too terrified of the Nazis stealing it. It is the story of a rebel colonel who broke a direct order to save his men, and the day the mathematics of death were rewritten forever. To understand why this fuse was an outlier, you have to look at the price tag. In 1944, the United States was pouring money into 2 massive secrets. The first was the atomic bomb. The second was a tiny radio transmitter no larger than a coffee can. The US spent over $1 billion, nearly $15 billion in today's money, on the proximity fuse. It was the second most expensive secret of the war. The challenge was a system error for 1940s technology. Scientists had to figure out how to put a functioning radar system inside an artillery shell and then fire it out of a cannon at 20,000 times the force of gravity. Ordinary vacuum tubes would shatter like glass. A team at Johns Hopkins, working out of a building disguised as a used car dealership, solved it. They shrunk vacuum tubes to the size of pencil erasers and cushioned them in rubber. They created a battery that only activated when the shell spun at thousands of RPMs. The result was a smart shell. It emitted a continuous radio signal. When it sensed a solid object, be it a plane's wing or the frozen ground, it triggered the detonation. The Pentagon was so scared of the Germans capturing a dud shell and reverse engineering the technology that they banned the proximity fuse from being used over land. It was only allowed to be fired over the ocean to shoot down kamikazes or V-1 rockets. But then came Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16th, the German offensive smashed through the thin American lines. At the town of Monschau, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson watched as his reconnaissance squadron was being pulverized by an entire German division. Conventional artillery was too slow and too imprecise. Axelson faced a choice: follow the Pentagon's forbidden order and watch his men be slaughtered, or unleash the secret. He chose the latter. Without permission, he ordered his gunners to load the smart shells. What followed was a technological shock that broke the back of the German advance. The Volksgrenadiers were moving through the snow in tight formations. They heard the shriek of the incoming shells and did exactly what they were trained to do. They hit the deck. But the shells didn't hit the deck with them. The smart fuses sensed the ground 30 feet above the soldiers' heads and detonated in a perfect cone of death. Because the explosion happened in the air, the shrapnel wasn't absorbed by the dirt, it was projected downward with the force of a sledgehammer. It was a massacre. Entire squads vanished in seconds. The survivors panicked, screaming that the shells had eyes. Veterans of the Eastern Front, who thought they had seen every horror of war, found themselves weeping in the snow. No tree, no wall, no ditch offered protection. The Americans had effectively turned the sky into a weapon. The outlier effect of the proximity fuse didn't stop on the ground. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive airstrike to cripple Allied airfields. The Germans achieved total surprise. Hundreds of fighters caught the Americans on the ground, but as the German pilots turned back for home, they flew into a wall of smart fire. American anti-aircraft batteries were now equipped with the proximity fuse. For the first time, a gunner didn't have to hit a plane directly. He just had to get a shell near it. The statistics are staggering. Before the fuse, it took an average of 2,500 shells to shoot down one plane. With the proximity fuse, that number dropped to 1 kill for every 100 shells. Of the 277 German aircraft lost that day, 172 were brought down by ground fire. The Luftwaffe, already bleeding, never recovered. General George S. Patton, never one for hyperbole, declared, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." Post-war studies confirm the outlier value of Axelson's unauthorized choice. Although proximity-fused shells only made up 25% of the artillery fired during the Ardennes campaign, they were responsible for over 60% of German casualties. A single shell bursting in the air was mathematically 50 times more lethal than a shell that buried itself in the mud before exploding. The Germans had prototypes of this technology as early as 1940, but Hitler had canceled any project that would take longer than 6 months. It was a fatal strategic glitch. The Americans invested the $1 billion, did the hard science, and essentially invented the ancestor of every smart bomb and guided missile used on the modern battlefield. The proximity fuse wasn't just a better bullet, it was the birth of autonomous warfare. It was the first time a machine made its own decision about when to kill, independent of the soldier who fired it. For the German teenagers and battered veterans who died in the Ardennes, it wasn't a triumph of science, it was a betrayal by the very sky they lived under. They died in ways they couldn't understand, in holes that were supposed to keep them safe. Today, the tiny vacuum tubes that once guided those shells are the ancestors of the sensors in your smartphone and the satellites in orbit. But their first job was to prove that in total war, the most dangerous weapon isn't the biggest tank, it's the one that knows exactly where you're hiding. If the story of the $1 billion cheat code changed the way you look at WWII technology, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that real history, the outliers, still matter. Subscribe and turn on notifications to join our community as we decode the most incredible files from the archives of war. What do you think? If Hitler hadn't canceled his proximity fuse program in 1940, could the Ardennes offensive have actually reached Antwerp? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one.